really quite okay, and we've begun recording. So hello everybody, thanks for joining us. We are in the Adaptation group today, and I was just saying I hope that some of you have had the opportunity to attend the talks this morning. Really good start to the day. I'm hoping that this session is just as rich for everybody speaking and also for everybody talking. So we're going to be talking about adaptation today. Did I say adaptation? That's not even real English. We're talking about adaptation. Once you've got a sense of the terrain, you've got a sense of the things that need to be done, how do you change to a changing terrain? So we've got 3 talks. We're going to start with David. Now let everybody introduce themselves, but David will be talking to us about the value flywheel and doing something that seems to be something of a theme for today, which is live mapping. We had 1 live mapping talk last year, seems to be flavor of the month and everybody's up for it. So you're going to get to see David sweat through his attempt to live map. I hope everything works okay, David. So if you want to maybe give everybody a quick introduction, maybe give a sense of the background and context behind why you've chosen to talk about this subject today, maybe a little bit about what you do to give us a sense of how you look at the world. David.
Hi folks, my name's Dave Anderson. I'm a technical fellow at Bizarre Voice and also author at the Serverless Age. I've been part of the Wordly mapping community for many years and been using kind of Wordly mapping really to help change in companies, with lots of companies, large companies and small, to kind of drive change and really kind of, I would say, tighten up. Not really cloud adoption, it's how you get the maximum value from cloud. So there's your kind of brief intro. Am I good now to fire up the slides, Damien? Or?
Yeah, as you do that, what I'll invite everybody here listening and all the panelists to do is to basically, as you go along, number 1, my rules for my session are: number 1, there is no stupid question if it's asked early enough. There are some really knowledgeable people speaking to us today, and today is our opportunity to learn. So feel free, put it in the chat. Don't be embarrassed, don't be scared. It helps us in the conversation and means that we get the most from the day. I will avoid my tendency or desire to interject. I'll let you run for the full 15 minutes. What we've done in other talks is just do 1 or 2 quick questions at the end of each talk, and then do a large question and answer session at the end. So I will be tracking for any questions that come in. I'll be utterly undemocratic in which ones I pick or which ones seem most interesting. But yeah, go ahead, David. Thank you.
Cool, good stuff. Okay, hopefully this is coming through okay. There we go. So I'll just give a quick intro before we get going. I've kind of been using the phrase the serverless age because I believe serverless and serverless first gives companies a significant competitive advantage moving forward. And really what I'm going to talk with the adaptation theme is the value flywheel. So I've observed the model over the years. How can companies get into a point where they can kind of move with the market, either pivot or grow, or can use technology as that enabler and not as a dead weight to kind of slow them down? I've seen quite a lot of companies innovate, but then be held back by the very technology that innovated. So really it's how do you keep that value kind of flywheel turning. So my name is Dave Anderson, technical fellow at Bizarre Voice, and this work I've been working with Mark McCann and Michael O'Reilly, 2 fellow contributors at the Serverless Age. And some of this content will be featured in a book that is coming out next year in with IT Revolution Press with Gene Kim and others. So I'm looking forward to that. And I wouldn't say I'm enjoying the process of writing the book. For anyone who doesn't know what a flywheel is, you take even and distribute power. So often we have effort from the business side, the technology side, and they often clash and butt up. So really the value flywheel takes that and creates steady momentum. But enough of that. Let's start making a fool of ourselves. So I'm going to try and something very stupid here, and we'll see how we go. I'm going to just try and kind of build this map. So I'll try and illustrate the value flywheel. So the anchor for the map here, I've got as a senior executive, could be a CEO, could be a VP of product, could be a CIO. It's a senior executive in your organization. All right. So usually the high level of concerns of a senior executive, day one, it's operational efficiency. How can we go fast? How can we keep costs low? The bottom line of the business. And then there's a time to value element. How can we be sure that if we're driving change into the market, we can do that quickly? Not necessarily time to market, time to value. Right, that's a key component. But I see a lot of companies doing a cloud migration, but they haven't thought about what happens next. Now we've migrated to the cloud, what do we then do? And really time to value is a significant kind of metric for that. So another concern then is really business growth. That once you've got your operational efficiency and time to value, you want to think about where can we grow to? And then there's really a dependency on growth with what I would call secure, rapid experimentation. How can we try things to learn what's working well? And that's connected to customer need or customer obsession, as Mr. Bezos would say. And quite often around this point, companies realize that they need some kind of modern digital modernization, simplification, whatever. We've got old tech, we need to update that. From what I can see, those are some of the immediate concerns of somebody relatively high level in the organization. So then when you drop down into the traditional kind of IT/technology organization, there's other concerns. And these are patterns I've seen through many companies. There's always an ask for, okay, if we want to rapidly experiment, we've got the cloud, yeah, but we can't treat the cloud like a data center. We need to have cloud self-service. We can do things really quickly. And that kind of complicates things because your security needs to be a certain way and you need robust data insights to make sure you're doing the right thing. And there's also a need combined with digital modernization for rapid build. How can we build quickly? These are the traditional kind of dreams of many kind of IT departments. So then as we move forward, so I would call them initial kind of concerns, but then there's more long-term concerns. Like how well is your architecture positioned to take advantage of this new tomorrow? And really the phrase that myself and some others in the industry are using, it's a problem prevention mindset. You celebrate problem prevention. Let's stop things going wrong. It's not about celebrating problem creation, like the hero programmer who gets the system back up on a Sunday when it crashes. It's let's prevent outages and issues happening. That requires a very disciplined architectural kind of strategy. And one of the follow-ons from that is sustainability. If you do that, you can actually contribute to a low carbon footprint for your compute, and you also can actually create some real standards. But the stuff here on the right, that's getting I've kind of put it in commodity for a reason. That's not always obtainable. So when we step back and add a lens to this, where we bring in the kind of value flywheel, there's almost like an ILC lens here: innovate, leverage, commoditize. So the first phase of the flywheel is clarity of purpose. For your senior executive, there'll be a clarity of purpose. Like this is your top line vision, things that the CEO will talk to the company about. That's where go north, young man. But this is the things that we innovate on. Then there's what I call next best action. What are the things we need to do straight away to actually try and meet that need? But it's really the long-term value is some of the architectural, sustainability, and standardization things. These are the real valuable things, what I would call a commoditization. And one thing that I've noticed a lot through companies is this route is okay, this clarity of purpose, leverage. It's very hard to commoditize. That's where it gets kind of difficult. So this is what I'm starting to call as the value flywheel. But then as we go on to kind of build out what I would call a missing component, and this is MapCamp after all, challenge. A key enabler for all three of these phases of this flywheel, just kind of innovate, leverage, commoditize, is the idea of challenge. You need a mechanism to challenge standards, security, to really challenge the work that's happening. I don't mean challenge in a way to kind of slow things down. I've successfully used Wardley mapping in all of these phases to help people see where we need to get to kind of plot the movement and the inertia, which creates a healthy environment among technical leaders and also the environment success. And really what that is psychological safety, is having the environment where you can actually speak up and say, hang on, I know that was the policy of yesterday, but it's changed, it's moved. So I see this as the missing element of this flywheel. You probably the flywheel effect came from Jim Collins' Good to Great book that came out a few decades ago. I think mapping and that sense of challenge is an absolutely critical component of that. But okay, well, let's move in as we start to map this out. There are a few inertia points I mentioned, so let's kind of let's add those back in again. So we have an inertia point here for cloud self-service. Many companies treat the cloud like a data center, you know, and they don't actually use the modern cloud capability. There's for rapid build, I believe you need a serverless first mindset. You need to embrace the abstractions that the cloud vendors give you. A lot of companies don't do that. They build too low and create work for themselves, so they don't meet that rapid build. Well, data, lots of companies do not have their data squared away. Their data architecture is not fit for purpose. They have data, but they don't have insights. So there's I would call that a traditional database mindset where we're still thinking in tables, not thinking about kind of data points. And then for security, there's quite often a very traditional security stance where people treat like the perimeter detection, and you're not really doing kind of secure by design or kind of least privilege, which is part of the modern cloud. So there are significant inertia points. Things that, again, like usually what inertia is, it's things that have worked well in the past, but have now changed. The climatic patterns have changed. So as we start to move forward here, let's show some movement. So it gets messy. There's potential to move these next best action components over to the right, which will also bring over secure rapid experimentation to the right, which creates space. So what's the driver for this? I think if you have a mapping in your environment and you start to plot this landscape out, that technical strategy tied to the business kind of senior executive expectation, you can actually be very focused on what you have to move and overcoming these inertia points. A lot of the times these inertia points exist, but they're impossible for the executive to see. We understand things are going slow, but we don't know why. Quite often the result of the solution is to throw more money at things, which really don't fix the inertia. So I've showed some movement there. I just want to, let me just give me a second to clean this up a bit. This is where I make a fool of myself. So let's drop a few things out and tidy this map up a bit. All right. Just bear with me a second. Okay, I'll drop that out. So this technique has been borrowed from Mr. Adrian Cockcroft, who did this a lot slicker than I am doing it. So let's take those away and we'll bring back in those components once they've moved. So now we've moved. So we've, through our mapping, we've moved cloud self-service, rapid build, and data and security over to the right here. We've taken them out of custom build and moving them more towards, I wouldn't say they're commodity yet, probably more like product. And that in doing that, that's dragged secure rapid experimentation slightly over to the right, away from custom build. So as you can see, having a really focused technical strategy at this level creates space up above here. So then as we continue, so what? The big so what, right? We've clarified where's the need. Like any of these maps, certainly the more I map out technology and IT, I'm starting to see lots of shapes and different things that are almost repeatable patterns. One that Simon talks about a lot is this idea of when you move things to the right, a commoditized capability creates an enabling capability, which creates new value up in the top left here. So this enabling capability, whatever it is, this creates a what next. For the executive, this is huge because you've taken some of the concerns to the right, improved them, and created space for new innovation. And that's really the commoditization has driven new innovation. This is something that very few companies actually make. So let's take a pause there and kind of maybe put some annotations on this map as I start to close out. Hopefully everyone's following this. I've stuck a couple of quick annotations here. So number one, The clarity of purpose should be fairly constant. If your senior executive team say we have 3 top goals, they'll probably remain high-level goals: operational efficiency, time to value, business growth. Whatever way they're phrased, they're always thereabouts at the high level that kind of vision. So, these don't change too much in a single company. They're I wouldn't say they're evergreens, but it's not like they change every month. Number 2, once the technology organization hears about these goals, it's very easy to say we need X, Y, and Z, but that's like the next best action. But actually connecting those to technical moves is difficult. The real technical strategy over here, which is your good architecture practices, sustainability, standardization, that often seems unobtainable because you're stuck here because the inertia is kind of holding you back. This idea of a value flywheel, where we take this top level, clarity of purpose, and we spin in the next best action, move things to the right, and go back up into the innovation. That kind of flywheel turning effect, where you're doing next best action changes to drive against the long-term value. This, in my experience, this can spin pretty quickly. And really the enabler for this is the mapping component down below, that idea of challenge. I like architects, product leaders, executives to challenge the thinking and make sure we move with pace. And that's really what opens up new innovation. One of the things I see is that we rarely link the top level here, what the executive sees, with this mid-level, which is kind of what a lot of the technology leaders see. There's often a break here where we don't make that. And again, in the worldly map, you see the visibility has dropped. So these things are lower down. A couple of key mindsets here. Code is a liability. You can't code your way out of this. You need to use higher order services to move quickly. So getting that mindset in is really first, which I call serverless first. This isn't just a technical system, it's a socio-technical system. So although there's technology here, there's also people, which is where the mapping helps. I believe engineering excellence and problem prevention, having a good discipline in your technical organization, actually creates space for innovation here on the left. And then quite simple, ABM, always be mapping. I have found in my experience over the last 10 years, constantly drawing these maps and helping people see what is the next best action and how that maps towards the long-term value is incredibly beneficial. Hopefully that makes sense. I know I'm nearly open time now, but this idea of the kind of the value flywheel is something myself, Mike, and Mark will be exploring in our book. There it is again, kind of drawn slightly differently. This idea of purpose, clarity of purpose, time to value, map the market competition, drives challenge, environment for success, the socio-technical view, and mapping your capability. Next best action, what can we do right now? Serverless first, don't build your way out of it. Speed up the engineers, and then that long-term value with problem prevention, sustainability. And this isn't an iteration that takes 2 years to do. You can do this very quickly, weeks. It's really about how to kind of plot that kind of movement. So that's me, Damien. Some more information on this on the serverlessage.com, where we're kind of putting some studies out about this kind of thinking. But I think for me, serverless first is a key enabler here, and how you kind of move this along and tie business goals with technology goals. So happy to take questions, but maybe we can open that up later on. So thank you.
Yeah, really good, really good. And as I said at the beginning, we'll have a moment just for 1 or 2 hot questions. I think with this talk, the majority are going to be tell us about the platform. And I think you can see in the chat, a lot of people are wowed by the actual just presentation. I love just how clear it was to understand and to follow. So really appreciate that. First thing is, let me pass to the rest of the panel to ask if you have any questions, observations, thoughts. Danielle, Andy?
This is fantastic. I love the way that you've broken this down into a pattern. I would call it a fractal pattern because I'm into that, but I'll save discussion of fractals for the end. The question I have is, What drove you? What brought you to the flywheel mentality in terms of why choose that metaphor versus something that's more kind of single iteration?
I think no, that's a great question. It's multiple iterations. And again, the big mindset to work against here is waterfall. X, Y, Z, we're done. You know, and the fact that a flywheel turns quickly, and the pressure coming into it from technology drivers and business drivers, they are inconsistent. So you need a way to keep that turning. You can't, as I've been in many architecture teams, you can't stop when someone's planning. There's always things that you can do. So once you visualize that flywheel, you can always kind of, you know, keep adding in things. It gives you room to experiment, to fail, to try again. You know, it's about flow efficiency and kind of, you know, getting that flywheel turning. I think that is a mindset that definitely architects and technical leaders need to have an effect, because aside from everything else, that's a constant concern. So I've my experience, the idea of the flywheel, and it never stops turning. But the two important points are it's constant and it's fast.
Danielle, any thoughts? Brilliant, thanks, David.
No, I really liked the point about how you get to visualize how hard or easy something really is to senior executives who are quite far away from the detail. It's a really powerful tool to communicate such really critical information, particularly when they may not have a really good understanding of the technology and what's involved. So I really liked you bringing that out in the presentation. It was really good.
Yeah, thank you.
There's one great question in here, and I'm going to add an addendum to it. So the question is, what counts as serverless for you? But flip it and also say, what do people think is serverless that you don't think is?
Well, it's not Lambda, put it that way. You know, it's put this way, we pay the cloud providers, the very good cloud providers, an awful lot of money, and then we treat them like a data center from 20 years ago. There are higher order services from all the cloud providers that can save you an awful lot of time and effort. Offload the work to the cloud provider, write as little code as possible from a programmer, and you know, build capability quickly. I hate the serverless phrase. It's done more damage than good, but the concept behind it of using a capability from a cloud provider that's fairly high level, I mean, that's the concept. It's really, the modern concept is to use a service to use a capability like eventing or data or compute. The legacy approach is to code everything yourself. Sometimes you have to code things, you need that capability, but it's not the answer every single time. A really good serverless strategy, serverless first strategy, doesn't include functions or Lambda. You can go higher again. But that I could do a whole other talk on that.
I bet you could. And my view is very similar. It's to do with allocation versus event driven.
Yes.
So it's around the billing and what that has for the overall cost economics.
Yeah, and then the standard serverless things about, you know, reduced operational burden, pay for what you use, event driven, that kind of pure focus on business outcome, no undifferentiated heavy lifting. Again, there's a list you could rhyme off.
We have so much to get through. We're going to have to come back to that in the larger question and answer in a second. But I think you might need to go through your tech stack for the presentation, specifically questions around VS Code integration. For now, I would love to introduce Danielle. Danielle, why don't you go ahead and just tell us a little bit about yourself, background, what you'll be talking about today.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Danielle, and I work at the Co-op and have done for the past 20 years. I've worked in and out of technology, architecture, business architecture, enterprise architecture, digital through my time at the Co-op. I'm currently head of engineering and also head of the office of the CTO in our new combined technology function, which we launched at the beginning of this year. So today what I'm going to be talking about, it's something I wanted to talk about last year, but I wasn't able to, the timing just wasn't right, was around how we adapted worldly maps to help design our new operating model. So that's the topic of my talk today.
Fantastic. If you want to go ahead, you're using slides today, so no live coding. I think we're all a bit tired of that by now. You know, it's. I'm joking. I'm joking. Really, really, really good. So if you're going to be showing some slides, okay, great.
Yeah, I am. So I'll make a start. So so I'm just going to talk you through our design story. So I'm not going to go too much into the actual content of the actual design itself, but more in the tools and techniques that we use, Wardley maps being one of them, to get to that, and why it was important, and why it was new as well to us. So we had a brand new strategy that we worked through in the 2019 at the co-op, but there was some question marks around whether we had the right operating model across the whole of the co-op to deliver it. Now, not forgetting that the co-op is like 175 years old. It's got lots of heritage. Everybody knows what it is, but also we carry a lot of legacy as well. And that's in terms of many things, of ways of working through to technology. So we decided not to use a consultancy to do this. Our new CFO wanted people who were at the co-op, who knew the co-op, to work through this. So a team of people were assembled from sort of organizational design specialists to Lean Six Sigma specialists. And I was recalled from my role of head of technology to dust off my enterprise architecture skills to support with this. And because I've been at the co-op for rather a long time. So we did a big piece of discovery where we gathered like an enormous amount of data. So that was interviews with colleagues, lots of data around our costs, data around our capabilities, just to really uncover what we had and how much of it we had and how well it performed. What came out of that discovery, that from looking at the strategy, technology and digital were identified as a key area of focus, which is no surprise given the way the world is changing. So this was our timeline that we had. So I'm going to talk you through some of the steps that we went through. So we started in August 2019 and going right through to sort of launching officially the new structures in 2021. And we had very helpfully COVID right in the middle of all of that, which was not helpful. One of the things we discovered during discovery was in previous attempts to do the operating model, there was an issue around the positional power of some of our functions. So there was a model that we used we called internally the Campbell Model, which helps you understand sort of the accountabilities, the positional power of various functions. And some of these things weren't clear. So we had functions that believed that they were policy, but actually there were no consequences for not following their instruction. There wasn't a clearly defined way of identifying what operating work was, so what was critical to deliver the value chain. We have many different businesses, and we also have a corporate centre that supports all of them. So there's a few handoffs here and there. There's things that we bring together for to standardise and reduce costs. But again, we still had some pockets of duplication. So we use this model to really help us understand how different parts of our organisation needed to operate to be successful. And this led to quite a lot of soul searching and being really honest about, I think I'm policy, but am I really being treated like policy? Things like digital are clearly like a core resource, but in some instances we're being treated like a shared service, which just wouldn't have worked. So this identifies clearly how your function needs to operate, or your particular area of the business and types of people and resources need to operate. But this model needed a currency, much like you see with Wardley mapping. It's a topic that people kind of agonise over quite a lot. Like, what currency do we use on the Wardley map? But for looking at digital and our IT functions, we needed to be a common currency that we all understood, because there's an awful lot of terminology that we use that is essentially, we're trying to talk about the same thing, but we use different language, and that has led to some misunderstandings in the past and us not working together as effectively as we possibly could do. So we settled on capabilities, and as luck would have it, the year before, we'd done a big piece of work between the technology functions, the IT functions as was, and digital, in coming up with a common capability model. that lifted up the understanding of capabilities to an extent that no matter whether you worked in IT, in more traditional ways of working, through to really agile, lean teams, they could recognise what capability was trying to be delivered. So this is what it kind of looks like a very quite traditional model there, with the leading capabilities at the top, the supporting capabilities at the bottom, and then right through the spine is the value chain, so the purpose for which technology and digital actually exist to provide. And that went down to a low level of detail, and this was the currency we used to really kind of unpick and understand what was happening in the functions and what capabilities they provided. So when we designed a workshop around this, so we created a grid, which is a bit similar to a Wardley map, and we mapped on there the different capabilities and the number of times they exist, and really where they sat, how were they really treated. We saw that there were lots of duplication, and we had to be really brutally honest with ourselves about how we really operated. Then we moved them to a place where we could really understand like where things needed to be, what type of function that needed to be. And we also put some missing items on there that we just didn't have too, so we could really understand that. Now, typically from this point onwards, what that would lead to is start to look at structures and who reports to who and how many of them and what roles people might play. But that wasn't enough for the transformation we wanted. So yeah, this leads into structures. So what it couldn't help us answer the questions were, do we buy stuff or build stuff? And do we work in Agile or do we work in waterfall? And through the discovery, these were things that were identified as key tension points that we had between what was digital and what was our IT functions. Because typically as new change was being delivered, it would be delivered in the way that that function knew how to do or had seen success in the past. And as we start to see more digital initiatives coming through, being done in a waterfall way, it doesn't work as well. And also on the flip side, the digital catching work that really should have been handled in a different way. So we decided to look at a tool that might help us with that. So the question was, could we adapt a Wardley map to help us understand that landscape and the ways in which we can organise? Because if you go straight to structures and you go straight to roles, then you miss the bit about aptitude and attitude. So the pioneers, the settlers, the time planners, and the different roles that are needed for those things. If you miss this part out, you can end up designing a structure that can't handle the different types of work we need, or not enough of the types of roles that we need to facilitate the types of work that are going to be coming down the track to support the strategy. So the answer was absolutely yes, we could definitely do it. So next slide, I'm moving on. So we designed a 2-day workshop. We had a mix of our 8 IT and digital colleagues. We decided on applications as a currency because that was the best common denominator we had across the piece. We had 3 rolls of blackboard wall, paper, chalk pens, about 600 pre-written cards, Sharpies, coffee and biscuits to make this happen. But we prepared the attendees with some Wardley mapping stimulus as well, so they could start to understand what was going to happen in the session and how they worked, and give them some examples. So this is an example of something that we shared. So the evolution curve, we flipped it the right way for mapping because it appears the other way in a lot of the stuff online, just so people get a feel of why there is a difference between something that sits in Genesis and something that sits in commodity. Like, not all technology is the same. You don't deliver it in the same way. You don't have the same people wrapped around every single thing that you look after in a function that is trying to be both digital and look after more enterprise type of applications. So this stuff was quite helpful, but cognizant that it does take a lot of practice to really get your head around Wardley mapping. So we had to create a bridge, and in using applications as a currency, that really helped us. So we focused on that current landscape, and then we started to move things to where we thought they needed to be. What this also helped us do was identify some duplication, because we had, whilst we had one IT function, it actually contained probably about 5 different functions who had very different ways of working and had obviously adopted and grown over time. This is what it looked like. A lot of people in a room, lots of cards, lots of discussion. I will say that probably for the first 20 minutes, this session was really hard. I was doing a lot of pushing, a lot of standing up in front of the board, putting things on there. But actually, after about 20 minutes, it kind of started to run itself. People started to talk to each other, they started to collaborate, they started to understand each other's worlds a little bit more. And actually, myself and Elliot, who was supporting me, could actually just sit back, eat some biscuits, and just watch them work, which was really good to see. So it was big. It took all day, and that was our final map when we came out at the end of it. So we could very clearly see the sort of things that needed to operate in one way versus another, and what type of roles that we needed around it. So we had a second workshop where we focused on some more logical clustering and stress testing these clusters of things. So we just took another bit of a paper and started to just chalk this out on the board. And again, the facilitation had to be quite light, actually. It didn't need to push too hard, just needs to guide in the direction. They seemed to really understand where things needed to go. So we come to our more logical operating technology design. So we refined it further to sort of condense them a little bit more, so we could see where things needed to be and what kind of team structure needs to be put around stuff. And then we went through more of the typical phases then of looking at physical structures and roles and people and all the really hard part around designing a new operating model, where you were literally disassembling everything and reassembling it again. So that's quite tough, and we're still doing all this around COVID time. And then we went live in January. So what was the outcome? So I just want to show you two pictures that kind of we used to illustrate to our executive the difference between what we had designed versus what they had. It's something that doesn't come through very well looking at structure charts, or doesn't come through very well looking at presentation slides. I came up with an image to kind of outline that. So this is what we looked like. We had lots of towers and lots of horizontals, and some that were both overlapping each other, doing similar things. Quite hard to navigate, and also, but within those areas, things worked fairly well, but as a collective, not as well as we'd like it to, which then took us into something that was much more simplified, where we have a very clear place where the town planning needs to sit, and things that we might outsource, and the things that need to move more a more quicker pace and operate in a more lean way. So these are products that we might have bought, or products that we've built that are now in a phase of just continuous improvement, to a place where things that are brand new, that are more in discovery and proof of concept, can live as well, and also better facilitation of the things that support everything. So this is the biggest change that the co-op had ever done in technology, and we're not done, as in there's still a lot of work to embed what we've designed and support people through the change. This, in comparison, was the easy part. The hard part is where we are right now. So what did we learn from this? I really enjoy using Wardley maps because they are really good at creating a shared understanding. They're really good at bringing people together and enabling them to have that psychological safety, as David talked to earlier, so that they can have those conversations, particularly when you're talking about an organisational design that can be fraught with tensions and politics, and people genuinely feeling frightened of change, and for very good reason as well. So being able to do this and to do it in this way took us on a lot further forward. It also helped understand a little bit more about ways of working and having the right aptitude and attitude in the right places. And it's something that we're going to use on a regular basis to review our shape of our function, and how we configure ourselves around work, and what types of skills are we going to need in the future, and aligning that with what the strategy is demanding of us from the co-op. Also including purposeful design and about how we work was critical, because that's something that's often overlooked in pursuit of getting to structure charts, because there's usually a tension to get to that. Having this included really helped us outline the range of different ways of working that would need to be adopted, not just what we had before and no more. There was definitely a blend. And also that maps are really adaptable. The evolution of services can apply at different levels of the organisation, from the smallest component to the most coarse-grained component of the organisation. And it was a really useful tool to do this. It wasn't traditional. I would say there's no such thing as traditional worldly mapping. It wasn't traditional worldly mapping, but it enabled us to have those conversations. So I think that is the end of my talk. So thank you. A lot less technical than the previous talk, but about worldly mapping nonetheless. Thank you.
Danielle, thank you. So again, loads of clarity. Those slides, I want all of them, and I want to steal concepts, ways you've visualized, things that I've tried to describe to people, and I realized, my gosh, there's a whole journey and to describe them. My sales team at work, quite frankly, when we're talking of bringing dramatic change to a mature organization, this is like an amazing playbook for doing so. And I've got so many questions around, how did you get a whole team of people to map, first of all? How resistant were they? Is this something you did piecemeal and sneaked in, or did you do sort of a big bang session when you said, right, this really matters? There is so much in this chat. I'm feeling I might need to make an executive decision and say, actually, we're going to deal on this little topic for a little bit. There's so many questions in the chat, and I think we've got enough time. I've seen some of Andy's talk, and I feel that needs its own special space as well. So why don't we start with that? That was brilliant, thank you. And can I have your slides? I just want to look through. In fact, I'll let you do this. You can see the Q&A. Do you want to start by taking on, there's one, well, actually, this is a question from me as well. Any advice on how to run, kickstart a Wardley mapping workshop? And this is internally with stakeholders, and where you have social career capital in there as well. What fallback plan did you have in case any attendees did not contribute much in the beginning? That's a huge part of that question, because sometimes the people who need to contribute most don't, and therefore you don't have a clear picture.
So I would say the way to kickstart it and get this moving is to find some common ground, and not be too purist about the maps themselves and how they work. So in choosing applications as currency, it was something that everybody understood, and giving them examples of why things are a certain way up the x-axis versus the y-axis. Find particularly architects want some quite precision, like exactly which point do I put things on, and that can detract from the conversation. So just getting them to think more around what relative positions things need to be in. So that common currency, and finding an in instead of sort of overwhelming them with the whole concept of Wardley mapping can be quite scary, because it does look very different to the architecture maps that they've seen before, and can be quite hard to kind of get their heads around, particularly if you need to do it quite quickly. So that's how we approached it. Also providing them some stimulus ahead of time and examples of why things sit in certain places, and using examples of things they already knew and understood was really helpful. In terms of getting people to contribute who may not be contributing, that's just really good facilitation. As I said, the first 20 minutes were super hard, really hard, as people were trying to digest the information and understand what we were doing. And maybe not everybody had read everything before they came in the room, but it just takes one or two people to start putting things on the map that actually a bit of peer pressure starts to provide some impetus, and also putting something in the wrong place on purpose so that someone feels like, I need to correct that, that's not right. That also helped to but also just encouraging people who were just sitting back and not taking part to do so. In that particular instance, that didn't really happen. Everybody kind of got involved at some point.
Great. Follow on from Dave. Curious about what made the executive avoid the usual external consultant companies being brought in.
I think we'd done it a few times before, and that hadn't stuck and hadn't landed. And some of the feedback that the exec had was, we bring in people who don't know the business. We've got people who know this business very well, who've got skills to be able to facilitate this type of work. And also, part of the exercise was to reduce our cost base, but also to make sure that we had the right capabilities in place to support the strategy. So, it would feel a bit weird to spend X thousands of pounds on a consultant when we're trying to save money, and that hadn't worked in the past. So it was something they wanted to try. I think our new CFO, Shireen, coming in, was a very pragmatic individual, and could see some of the talent that we already had and knowledge. So she found that more valuable than bringing in externals at the time.
Oh, really good. A last one from Bruno, and I know I'm rushing through, but I want as many questions to be answered. We'll then go into Andy's talk, and then we'll have an opportunity at the end to talk about all of the discussion. So if there are any sort of trailing questions, I'll try to bring them in there. From Bruno, did you need to use any metrics, tangibles or contributors to grasp the value of the exercise? This is the mapping exercise, not the overall, not metrics around the business.
The mapping of the exercise.
So let me just read that second part again. Tangibles for contributors to grasp the value of the exercise. And I'm seeing that as the mapping exercise, the exercise of people coming in. Let me know, Bruno, if I've misunderstood that or misinterpreted that.
Just trying to think the best way to answer. I think most of the people who were attending the session had been in a place where the buy versus build and agile versus waterfall had been a source of pain and contention, and they often struggled to answer it. So when I said, there's a tool that can help you answer that question quite easily, and we could use it and adapt it to this, there was a lot of interest in doing that. And also the CIO at the time gave me quite a lot of leeway to design and run a session that would help us get over some of those tension points. So he put a lot of trust in me to do that.
Gotcha. So there was a bit of exec buy-in in the process, and I suppose that would have given people the right message in that you need to contribute to this.
Yes.
Had a little bit more scrutiny, I suppose, than just the activist or the enthusiast who decides to sort of bring it in.
Yes.
Real quick last one from me. What was the biggest, and by this I mean the oldest, learning or change? So 175-year-old organization, was there a thing that you thought, gosh, we've been doing that wrong for 70 years? Not as opposed to it's wrong for now.
No, we didn't find anything. We've analysed our business to death. I mean, there has been in the past, because we had a lot more businesses, and the things that we've discovered that we didn't know were still happening, but not in this most recent one, no.
Fantastic. Well, look, there are more questions for you. I hope we'll have time at the end to cover some of those. Take a moment just to look through in the Q&A in the chat, in case you can prep for that. I'm now delighted to introduce Andy Smolok. Andy, I've deliberately been just kind of like delaying because I know you get super passionate and energetic, and by delaying I thought I could actually just pee you off a little bit in such a way that it would make it even more entertaining. I've seen some of this talk, and I'll openly admit to having read 3 books on alien life, approaches to it, right? As a direct result of this conversation. It is not the subject matter. It's not the subject of the talk. However, he does bring aliens into it, and it is just absolutely thought-provoking. And it made me question a couple of assumptions, I suppose, that I'd made about how I think about problems. So I really hope you enjoy this. We're going to talk about fractal gameplay, please introduce yourself, the context in your life and work that caused you to be sort of thinking about this. And yeah, crack on and tell us. Oh, you're on mute, by the way.
This one's really easy. The context was I got made redundant by Google. No, the fun thing was I spent over a decade building ecosystems. That's my thing, right? And you can kind of think of the last 2 years as a bit of an entrepreneurial sabbatical after decades in tech building these ecosystems. And I suppose it's a good place for me to plug that. Hey, I am on the lookout for a new proper role, so I will leave that out there and not come back to it. But I'm based in London, coming to you from Camden Town right now, and I'm sharing with you basically the output from 2 years of trying to distill all the things I've learned about building ecosystems into fractal patterns. And why are they fractal? I'll get into that. But the short answer is they're scale invariant patterns. You can see them at any slice of a time scale. You can see the pattern repeating. It's self-similar, right? And so we can go into fractals in infinite detail. What I really want to do, though, is get into, what are we talking about with respect to gameplay and Wardley mapping. I'm using the term gameplay a little bit different than Simon does, and I can explain exactly how I'm overloading and abstracting that term. But let's start with the common anchor that we all understand. We all understand this loop, right? Whether you call it the OODA loop or Sun Tzu's strategy cycle, we're talking about the game overall, and then the gameplay. How do we dimension out and map the gameplay around it? And in order to get into the right frame of mind, what I'm going to do is kind of take you into a frame of reference that's that you always assume is there, but you don't really think about it much. So, how did you form an awareness of the present moment and your place within it, the context of that, right? When you arrived in this game that we call life, right? How much of the gameplay had already been programmed within you? And how did you make sense of the game along the way, right? Clearly you've picked up a bunch of cultural frames of reference, of models, all kinds of stuff, right? And as you got good at understanding and making sense of each level of gameplay, right? What was it that you did to master that? And how did those experiences form your identity? And I'm going to use a term here called identity loop, because I think it's just as important for us to understand as individuals as organizations. I like to think of companies, for example, as artificial life forms, right? And so when I ask this question, it's not only about me or you as individuals, it's also about the organizations that we represent, right? How does that identity loop enable me, you, our company, our nation, right, to choose where to direct attention and engagement? Because that's ultimately the primary degree of freedom that we have. Where are we directing our attention and engagement? And what tools do you employ to make sense of the gameplay at each of these dimensions, right? And I'm going to be a little provocative here and say, okay, can a robot grasp the context of who you are and what you've learned about the game and how you approach the game, how you frame the game, and then pull back a little bit and say, okay, what about the artificial life form known as a corporation, right? How does it master and adapt to human gameplay, right? And the reason why I call a corporation an artificial life form is that you can take every single individual in that corporation and replace them, and it still exists. Even if it's dead, it still exists as a concept in the minds of everyone who's been exposed to it, right? And so there's this question of, how does this happen? And how do we guide its gameplay, right? Can we map human gameplay for something that's not fundamentally human? And what are the fundamental game loops that we play as humans, right? Now, there are an infinite number of ways to partition this human gameplay loop, right? We can spend lots and lots of time arguing about which particular method of dividing this circle there is. Now, of course, we always have the ability of just splitting that circle in half and picking our favorite dichotomy: good, evil, pick your, alive, dead, whatnot. But the really interesting stuff happens when you identify more than 2 points along that loop, and you begin to understand the way that each segment interacts. And that's why the strategy cycle or the OODA loop or any other loop that you identify as a valid fractal loop, fractal in the sense that you can identify this loop functioning at any given point in time. Take a slice of time, a small slice, a big slice, you're going to see this loop in action. And out of that loop, you're going to see some emergences, and that's what we're going to go into here. And so when we use the term gameplay here, I'm using it in a slightly different sense that Simon is. It's compatible, but it's overloaded, right? And so what I want to ask here is, how might we frame the nature of gameplay patterns, right? If you're going to build a map of gameplay, and if you're going to identify points on that map, what are the different dimensions? How many different dimensions do you need? What is parallel? What's orthogonal, right? You've got to get some basic dimensioning out of the way in order to make sense of gameplay, in order for particular gameplay to make sense, right? And so the first question, and really what started me on this journey as an individual, was how do I frame the nature of these gameplay patterns? And more specifically, how do I tie each of these dimensions to a primary emergent experience that all of us feel like we can understand and communicate with each other, right? And so I'm not going to go through this list right now because I've got a slide on each one of these, but the point here is that for each dimension of gameplay, right, there is a primary emergent experience, and there's something driving the loop that creates that, right? And so that is what we're going to go through. We're going to go through these, 5 or 6, because this is a loop, right? 0 and 5 are essentially the same place. It's just going from an individual to an organization. I'll explain more of that as we get into it, but each time you've got to create that loop, you've got a programming and a viral currency. Now, you can argue, does a thought program an emotion, or does an emotion program a thought? The point is, it's a loop, right? And one of them tends to be more viral than the other in certain conditions. Now, sometimes they'll flip. There's a lot of cultural dynamics that get involved here. I'm not so worried about which one is the programming, which one is the viral currency, so much as, is this adequately explaining the loop? And is that loop distributing resources, right? One of which is limited, like time, right? One of which is limitless, like energy. Now, of course, there are limits to energy, but limitless in the sense that we can control the amount of energy that we're putting into a system. We can't control the amount of time that exists to execute that, right? And so I'm going to also introduce, with each of these gameplay loops, something that I call a derivative. I'm going to start with that because it's a little bit more obvious. It's, how does this gameplay loop play out over time, right? And I call this an external coherence that you see. And then if you look at the viral currency and you try to get to the smallest possible unit of that currency, that's where you get to this concept I call integral, right? You play that out over time, you get the derivative of that, right? Same with the programming, right? And there's an emergent coherence that comes out of each one. Now, I don't expect you right now at this stage, I'm getting really, really abstract. What I'm doing is giving you the legend for each of these 6 slides where we're going to be going over the different kinds of gameplay loops that we deal with as humans, right? So as I frame each of these gameplay, I'm also going to try to hit on some key questions that fall within a particular gameplay loop. Now, there are some questions that fall within all gameplay loops, which is essentially win the game, enjoy the gameplay, follow the rules, pick 2, right? What's your priority, right? In every gameplay loop, it's possible to pick 2. It's essentially impossible to equally prioritize all 3. Now, if you have an infinite amount of energy and time, you can, right? But we can't. So you've got to prioritize. Now, then there are some ancillary questions, right? Does everybody have to play the same game, right? This is an interesting question in terms of diversity. And how do we produce more winners? If we allow for more games, how do we produce more winners? This is where diversity and inclusion comes in, right? But that applies to every gameplay here. So let me apply this legend to internal gameplay. That seems like the logical place to start. How do our thoughts and our emotions distribute the time and energy that we have, right? By the way, I'm going to ignore this bottom thing. If you chase through the slides afterwards, you'll see that there's this opening and closing dynamic. I'll leave that for your own chasing. But what I do want to do is come into and dive deeper into, okay, when I say emotions, how do I get down to the smallest possible emotion? Well, let's call that a feeling. When we talk about thoughts, what's the smallest possible thought? You know, let's call that an idea, right? The interplay of that is essentially what forms your identity loop, right? This is the narrative that is constantly playing in your head. And it's the interplay between those thoughts and emotions that allows that to happen over time. That leads to your temperament and your inner narrative and what people experience as your character, right? Now, all of these things, I'm picking words that are overloaded. You might not like some of these words. You might find a better word. I am not wedded to these words except to the extent that they allow conversation to happen around this loop, right? And at this internal loop, this is where consciousness emerges. And these are the questions that we as individuals, or when you're dealing with identity as a group, right? This is where these questions play out. Now, once you've got some internal gameplay, right? We start out where we don't actually have an ability of externalizing our internal gameplay, right? We start out where in psychology it's described as the big other, right? We don't even recognize that we're separate at first until we get to the point where we've mastered enough of that internal gameplay, and then we begin social gameplay, which the emergence of that is cohesion, where you can get multiple people that each have their own internal gameplay going on, and you can get a cohesive result. Right. And if you think about, okay, what is the most viral part of that loop, right? It's the actions that we take and others see, and we program it with the journeys, right? We talk a lot about customer journeys, right? It's because you need to have a coherent journey in order to take someone somewhere. We already know that it requires emotions and thoughts, right, for anyone to go do anything. That's marketing 101. But what are the journeys that allow us to do something coherently outside of ourselves, right? And what gets distributed? Well, it's security. When we talk about psychological safety, that's essentially what we're talking about here. I'm going to condense that down to security. And then sustenance, in the sense that as all of us have social needs, right? And how do we as social groups distribute that, right? If we go a little bit deeper and look at the emergences here, what's the smallest possible action? It's a step. What's the smallest possible journey? It's a state. The interplay of that leads to development. Play that out over time, you get movement. Now that could be political movement, that could be physical movement. The journeys over time, right, they lead to progression. That interplay is where evolution comes from, right? So if you start with that as your kind of, first dimension, this is the loop that happens after we get outside of ourselves and begin interacting socially, right? We're asking this question of ourselves, where am I going? What am I doing? Where are we going? What are the journeys that we're choosing? Who's with us? Who's against us, right? That's all happening in this loop, right? And then you get to a certain point where you realize, oh, there's lots of journeys. There's lots of social groups I can be part of. And the need for multiple groups to form a loop of their own, a community of their own, becomes apparent. And what we begin to do is we program with the principles that emerge from these groups, right? And the viral bit are our values. And of course, these are abstracted, but I think it's well understood that communities form around values and principles, right? And what's being distributed? Well, authority is being distributed, right? That there's only so much of it. And influence, right? Just like energy, you can have a lot of influence being distributed. You can have just a little bit, but that's what gets distributed at this loop, right? Well, what's the smallest possible value? Let's call it a belief. What's the smallest possible principle? It's a reason. This loop leads to ideology, right? You play that out over time, you get doctrine, and this is a little bit more general than the specific way that Simon uses the term, but I can't find a better word right now. And theory and the interplay between that doctrine and theory is what leads to a system. This is where we answer the questions: what do I value? Who do I trust? Why do I believe? What's good? What's bad? What's important, right? And it naturally leads to structural gameplay, because once we've got communities, right? Communities form around different nucleation points. And in order for larger structures to form, like nations, for example, right? We had to move beyond the simplistic structures that kind of naturally form in communities and program forms and conventions with regulations. And this is where we begin to distribute capital. There's only so much. And rank, right? There's as much to give out as we want. Now we could flip that around as well. This is where we start to see that you could flip this the other way and still be right. The point here is you get to the smallest possible units. You've got to practice. You've got a rule that leads to order that plays out over time as norms and laws and government emerges. And at this structural level of gameplay, right, this is where we start looking at power, right? Where do I belong? How do I fit in? Where do we belong? Who's in control? What's allowed? What's legal? What's not, right? And I kept some of these emergent patterns out of the earlier versions just because I find that it's distracting. But at this level, you can start to see this is where societies, science can emerge at this level, diplomacy, right? Political systems, nations, right? Corporations, artificial life forms have been with us for thousands of years, right? I find this whole AI discussion amusing because we've let these artificial life forms loose on the world, often with really, really disastrous effect, for many, many centuries, right? And the fact is that these things already exist and they're already loose, and in fact, what makes the strongest ones strong are the networks that they form, right? And we program these networks. And again, which one's more viral, the objectives or the metrics? you could argue either way. The point is there's a loop, right? And this is where, and what's interesting is we're in the point of time where we're at what's known as peak attention, right? There is so many things vying for our attention and engagement, right? There's only so much attention we can give, right? I'm really glad that you're giving some of your attention to me now, right? But the level of engagement that we have is variable, right? And when we talk about multitasking, what we generally mean is we're dividing up our attention among many, many different engagements, right, at a given time. And the hope is that we have tools that allow us to do that in an efficient, highly leverageable way. Well, let's go down. You know, we talk about data, right? What's the smallest possible metric, right? It's a datum, right? And I've kind of flipped this just to demonstrate that you could go either way. I keep flipping metrics and objectives, and I keep forgetting to do this on the bottom. But the point is, this is where you get production, right? And production can go out of control if we're not careful. Now, what we're in, and this is, you know, one of Simon's specialization, is understanding the derivative of this, which is industrialization, right? We're creating intelligence from all this. We've got lots of ambition that is coming out of it. And, you know, here we have all these systems, right, that are creating, you know, right now, you can think of the internet as the ultimate network, right? This is the big emergence from this. So where do we go next? What is everybody worshiping, right? It's fractal gameplay. It's where we're taking purposes and we're using purposes and programming purpose with orchestrations. And what are we distributing? Unity, right? It either exists or it doesn't, right? But the amount of resonance that exists there is variable. How much resonance can we create, right? And, you know, how do we take the smallest possible unit of purpose, the intention, and the smallest possible orchestration, the arrangement, and weave together effective interdependency? And how do we derive over time meaning and alignment? Now, I hate the new agey form of the word here. I can't find a better one though. Transcendence, right? How do we transcend? How do we operate an organization as effectively as we operate as individuals? And we forget that individual is closer to indivisible, right? We are a whole series of networks and systems, and you know, we're not always unified inside, right? We get sick, we have conflict, right? But yet we are visible in a coherent way as an individual. How do you do that with an artificial life form as a group? Well, you do that with fractals because they're scale invariant patterns, and that's the notion of fractal gameplay that allows an ecosystem to form, right? That's the emergence from it, is an ecosystem, right? Why am I here? How do I align with my ecosystem, right? And these are the basic patterns, right? Now, how does this help us? Well, what this allows me to do is understand, let's say I'm trying to teach a robot how to understand the difference between a moral discussion and a functional discussion, right? This is something that when you ask Google Assistant, you know, she cannot understand the difference, right? How do we do this for our organizations? Often we can't, right? This is where, you know, McKinsey gets lots of blame for going and enabling functional capabilities that are morally questionable, right? It's because we don't have good ways of separating out these different dimensions and understanding when are we having a functional conversation from a structural conversation, from a moral conversation, right? And so we need standards for gameplay mapping that'll allow us to understand why are we choosing the game that we're playing, and which dimensions are we trying to act on, right? We need experiments in gameplay mapping. This is one that that's near and dear to me. I direct this for the Sonophilia Foundation. The short version of this is, can we create fractal maps of our problems that allow us to be able to get those who are working on similar problems connected with those who have solutions, right? A problem is indistinguishable from a solution until you've got context, right? You need that mapping. So small plug for the Sonophilia Foundation and Matters.global. Some of my friends there, if you recently saw the announcement about AI finishing Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, those are my friends that formed the Sonophilia Foundation. Really cool stuff. But with that, it's time for discussion. This is, think of this as a provocation, and let's get to the discussion.
Wow. I mean, I take it personally as a personal provocation, right? Throughout the whole way. It's great. It really is. I enjoyed it even better the second time. I was going to ask you to share all of the links and ideas that you shared, because I did so much sort of background reading after we first spoke. For me, this talk hit right at the right time. I was thinking about animals, veganism, how we punch down, how we consider the people who are lower than us in the food chain, certainly in the way that we've built our world. And that's the bit that then had me completely flipping the argument and thinking, how about if someone else was pushing down? This alien life form that comes in, is smarter, is better than us at these things. How is our own morphology, the way we live our lives, forcing us to basically mismanage up and down the chain? And so this gave me a framework. I love the idea of taking the two extremes, the smallest sort of representation of something to its largest, really useful in the early parts of mapping when you're trying to determine what a thing is, to really think of its maximal, minimal scope. So really, really good. I'm going to shut up and ask for questions. First of all, from the panel, what did you think of that? Where do you think you can apply it, and sort of what questions do you have? I can't see you all on screen, so I'll just pick David.
That was awesome. I really enjoyed that. A kind of related question. I see many connections with kind of systems thinking. How well do you think people understand systems in the interactions you've had?
I think that's the fundamental issue, right? Is when you say system, right, everyone paints a different picture, right? And you've got everything from people feel oppressed by systems and want to tear down any system when it appears, and those who feel like our only hope is systematic scientific progress, right? And the reason why I focus on gameplay is it allows us to change the conversation from one of are systems good or bad to what are the systems that we're embracing and rejecting, and which ones do we think need changing, as opposed to is a system itself good or evil?
Yeah, very good. Yeah, I mean, you're in a system whether you like it or not, and if you destroy the system, a new one will appear. So, or you could use the phrase ecosystem, but yeah, absolutely.
Oh, sorry, Danielle, what did you think? I was on mute.
No, just listening to the presentation, it speaks very much to the ethics of the co-op and where we want to look at making better decisions around particularly technology and the choices that we make. So this is just fascinating, just fascinating.
I feel like it's the stuff you should spend a long time on discussing before you start a map, and then actually it's the fact that it's so big that forces you to start mapping. But it really, there are some fundamental things that you need to do and think about before you even get down to the, okay, let's map. And I think this really gives you a great framework to do so. We have some questions in the chat. Fabian asks, have you tried to map the concepts you have analyzed with an Archinet? And is described that as enterprise architecture meta model. I'm hoping that means something to you.
That's a new thing for me, but I'll definitely take a look. I think that the essence of this, right, what I'm talking about is meta modeling, right? And so anything that is capable of meta modeling ought to be capable of modeling gameplay, right? And if it's not capable of doing that, then there's a problem. If it can't handle a loop, for example, right? This is the big problem we've got. We've got tools. If you think of Excel, Excel is really struggles with loops, but it can handle hierarchies really ridiculously easily, right? We need essentially tools that will allow us to do this. So I'm always on the lookout for tools that can handle the kind of real-time exploration of dynamic loops. And if that's a tool that lets you do that, I'm anxious to try it.
If we can pick two, why can't we pick three in all gameplay loops? That's from Ahmad.
So we can. It's just that it's a question of how much fidelity or effectiveness are you willing to sacrifice, right? You can do a kind of mediocre job of all three, and then the question is, are you having an impact by doing that, right? So it's not so much that you can't do all three. It's a question of how much priority and emphasis are you giving to each. For every move you make, you're going to sacrifice one of those dimensions, or you're going to need capital or energy or any number of the things that are that cost, right? Another way of looking at the viral side of the loop is it's a currency, right? And so if you've got lots of that currency to put in, then you can get closer to the center of that balance. But as you get closer to the center, you can think of it as an exponential curve, and that exponential curve, the cost to make further improvement, just like going from 5 nines to 6 nines, right, gets exponentially more expensive.
Got you. So one last one, this is from Catcher. The hardest thing to formulate is a proper question for the map. So this is really the question about how do you constrain an idea or a subject that is very large.
So in my case, and I've done a lot of mapping with a lot of different groups as diverse as Christie's, the auction house, and tiny startups that are just trying to figure out where they play. And in many cases, what I like to use the gameplay dimensions for is picking a starting point. At what level am I likely to provoke? We can essentially operate. The way I look at this is we're essentially operating at 1.5 of these dimensions at any time, right? We can be anchored in structural or anchored in functional, and reaching down or reaching up towards another dimension and trying to bridge those two. So for me, it's always been helpful to be able to say, all right, where are we playing? Where do we think we're playing, right? And where do we want to play? And then pick as an anchor point either the aspirational side or the practical side, and then start extrapolating from there using the gameplay. So that's a very abstract answer. I don't know if it's concrete enough without a specific example to tie to it, but that's how I approach it.
I'd really encourage everybody to see this as the beginning of a learning journey. So Andy, I think you've posted your slides, so that links to some of the foundational material. I want to come back to both you and David on platforms. So you both used a platform to present. If you could just tell us what you're using, what's in the stack, how you put it together, because there's a lot of interest around that. And David, if we have enough time, I'd love you to just expand a little bit on some of your provocative statements around serverless.
So I'm using something called OVS, and so I can switch between presentation view, camera view, presenter view, and I can compose these and move myself around, right, at any time. In fact, I was supposed to be paying attention to hopefully not overlap anything important on the slides, but hopefully I didn't skip anything. OVS, OBS. O, B as in boy, S as in server, and it's on both the major platforms, and it works great. Creates a virtual camera, which is what I'm using.
Fantastic. David.
Cool. Yeah, I'm just using it's Visual Studio. There is a fantastic plugin. It's an open source project. I think it's Damien Scalehorn wrote it. It's kind of maps as code. It's been referred to. It's the same engine that's used on onlineworldlymaps.com. Under the hood, there's kind of like that meta language. So I mean, it's nice using that in the web page. The web page is fantastic, but if we're doing something a little more detailed, I find getting the plugin for VS Code, Visual Studio Code, is kind of nice. So you just go and search for the plugin and the extension. Just search for Wordly, and it brings it in, which means you can save your map as text in it's like a .wm format, which is nice for putting them in source control, etc. And you get a bit more auto completion, etc.
Really
so
cool.
Yeah, it's great for collaborating on maps and storing them, and as they evolve over time, you can kind of keep your own repository of them.
Fully expecting that next year we'll find every speaker's using one of those two platforms if we're following what happened last year. John Porter had a question, last thing before we close up. It does lead us back into that serverless chat. David, thanks for the great walkthrough. Interested in your comment of higher order serverless constructs. I know you shared links, but you got a couple of minutes.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, it's like, I'll talk about AWS because I know that platform best, but it's the same on other cloud providers as well, you know, completely. But if you think of a lower order of compute like EC2, like just getting a box, as you start to layer on abstractions on top of those, what the cloud providers do is they keep all those layers open, but they're constantly going up the stack. And it depends on what your goal is. If your goal is to have fun building a system, you know, go lower down. If you need to deliver a business capability quickly, go higher up. I mean, let the cloud provider do the operations for you, put in the abstractions, tie things together, let them provide the, you know, the multiple 9 availability. A good example is something like step functions. You can use step functions, event bridge, to tie together events and integrations with things. You can create a full integration without writing any code. Low code platforms in the past have been problematic, but the scale we're starting to see now with the cloud providers is really creating a whole new level of capability. And again, you know, a lot of people think when they hear serverless, well, I now have to rewrite my entire system in Lambda. You know, I think of Lambda as glue. You're using it to integrate different parts of the system together. But what really requires, you think of your solution as a system, a collection of components that wire together, not as, you know, 500,000 lines of code. Because as I said earlier, code is a liability. The less code you have, you don't have to maintain it, secure it, support it, have teams. You know, it's less risk for your business. So again, that's, and you can see what AWS are doing and other providers. They're starting to add more higher level abstraction. So I would definitely look at that. There's a nice, I've posted a link there, but the terminology is difficult. Amazon have started using the term modern application development, which is another, and they have a lot of great content on AWS and Amazon and on the site aws.com. We talk about serverless and modern application development. But you know, again, one thing that I found very beneficial is then you say, well, do you need an engineering team? Yes, you do. But one thing I found is if you take a team first mentality, give the team a goal as opposed to a set of instructions, and then train that team in well-architected cloud capability, then they will find the most advantageous solutions. So it's a new area that's incoming, but I don't think it's well understood.
No, really interesting, and one it's new to me, so certainly I could do some homework on that. We've got less than a minute left, so I'll wrap up before we close up the room. We have heard all about serverless, an actual real implementation. We have seen a playbook for how to enact change in a big, mature organization, and actually how to sell maps and get people to get involved. And we've had a mind-blowing, mind-expanding talk from Andy on really dealing with fractals, dealing with different levels of abstraction, and how you can, this is in pre-mapping, how you can basically start building a framework to understand some of the more abstract concepts that affect a system or a group of systems. So I think that's been a brilliant session. Thank you so much for your questions, for your engagement. It's been really great, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of the day and the other sessions later on. Please take a moment before you leave just to pick up all the links and things that are in the chat, because they will disappear otherwise. Thanks to the speakers and to everybody who's taken the time to join.